share my screen. So good afternoon, and I'm going to talk today about nutrition for digestive tract health. And much of what I have slides on has been covered, I believe, in great detail. So for those slides, I'm going to jump very quickly through because I believe you all have had a very good background in gastric ulcers. So the track I'm going to take is primarily in how feeding helps in the treatment of digestive orders. And I'm just going to pick out a few, kind of concentrate and talk about some of the new research, particularly the research from Kentucky Equine Research over the last few years, which have resulted in some really nice products that can help in supplementation of in treating some of these digestive disorders. But background, just of course, the health of the horse that is associated with the digestive health would include gastric ulcers, hindgut dysbiosis, hindgut acidosis, and then of course colic laminitis. But the digestive health also plays a strong role in the well-being of horses, such as the appearance and management of stable vices. Nutrition, of course, has a huge effect on performance. It actually has more of an effect on behavior than we have thought sometimes in the past. Nutrition affects the immune function. Of course, what you feed the horse can have an effect on the horse's appetite. What you feed has an effect on digestive efficiency and what the horse gets out of its daily diet. And then, of course, body condition and weight. But the areas of concern and impact that I'm really going to touch on today would be gastric ulcers, of course, squamous glandular. And again, I'm going to fly through the slides that have background of gastric ulcers because other presenters have covered that thoroughly. But I'm going to touch a little bit more on some of the new research, as I mentioned. I will talk about hindgut acidosis, a little bit on right dorsal colitis, because that is an issue that we have some new information, relatively new in the past few years, and some potential help for dealing with right dorsal colitis. And then I'm also going to touch a little bit on leaky gut syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease, and just some general information on where we are on the horse's microbiome. But one of the things to keep in mind is that there is always a link between the gut and the brain, and that comes out as in the behavior. So things that are going on in the horse's gut, oftentimes the only thing that we see is behavior. And so that's what's going on with the gut certainly will affect the horse's behavior. So the areas of interest within the gut where we are focusing would be in the stomach, of course, which, as you all know, is a small compartment. It's 9% of the capacity of the digestive tract. The stomach really dictates the meal size, and I'll talk about that a little bit with starch overload, that too much starch in the meal, overloading the stomach and the small intestine. And then, of course, in the stomach, the digestive events that happen. Hydrochloric acid is secreted, the enzyme pepsin, which starts the digestion of protein, and then the saliva, the chewing that produces saliva, which, especially in the gastric ulcers, is such an impactful situation because saliva contains bicarb, which helps buffer the gastric acid. And then the next part of the gut, of course, is the small intestine, 25 meters long, 25% capacity of the GI tract. And in the small intestine, so much is going on. It's the primary site of digestion and absorption of nutrients. The starch is primarily absorbed as simple sugars through the small intestine. Fat is primarily absorbed in the small intestine. Protein absorbed in the small intestine is absorbed as amino acids. So although protein is certainly fermented in the hindgut, if it's in the hindgut, it is not fermented into amino acids. So we do want the protein digested and absorbed in the upper gut. And fat-soluble vitamins are primarily absorbed in the small intestine, and most of the minerals are at least partly, if not entirely, absorbed in the small intestine. In the small intestine, we have enzymatic digestion. So enzymes are produced, and that is the digestive processes in the small intestine. The large intestine, of course, in the horse is 65% of the capacity. It includes the cecum and colon. It is enlarged to promote fermentation because the billions of microbes, of course, ferment the nutrients. And anything that comes through the small intestine into the large intestine is, for the most part, subject to microbial fermentation. And the fermentation of plant fiber, because the primary purpose of the hindgut is fermenting the fibers from all the plants the horse ingests. And the fermentation produces volatile fatty acids, B vitamins, and vitamin K. And those, of course, are absorbed from the hindgut. And there's also a large amount of absorption in the large intestine of water and the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and chloride. So equine gastric ulcer syndrome, again, this topic has been well covered in this conference, but I'm just going to go through and touch in case there are, if there's anybody who has not listened to all the presentations, I'm just going to touch on EGUS, which includes ulcers found in either the squamous or upper portion of the stomach, which is equine squamous gastric disease, and also the glandular or lower region of the stomach, and ulcers in that area would be termed equine glandular gastric disease. We have so much more information on equine squamous gastric disease. There are different estimates of how many horses are suffering from equine squamous gastric disease. Anywhere from 58 to 100% of thoroughbred and standardbred racehorses in training may be affected with ESGD. The glandular disease is a relatively new development, and warm bloods and sport horses, 47 and 35% respectively, appear to suffer more from glandular ulcers than other breeds. And of course, vet diagnostic and medication, including omeprazole, are needed to treat, but I am staying to the nutrition portion as I am not a veterinarian. So the squamous ulcers, again, much more common. The acid injury is the primary cause of the squamous ulcers, and work and acid splash are important in this situation. Squamous ulcers usually respond to omeprazole, and risk can be reduced by feed change. We'll talk about that. Glandular ulcers, much less common. They are inflammatory lesions, different risk factors. They're harder to treat and different treatments needed. And to date, dietary changes are not nearly as effective for glandular ulcers than on squamous ulcers. But in general, the cause of ulcers, one way to think of it is just it's an imbalance between the protective and damaging factors. The protective factors include chewing, the stimulation of production of saliva, and the bicarbonate in the saliva helps buffer the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Feed in the stomach will help buffer the acid. Buffers in the feed can help with buffering the acid in the stomach. Of course, the fibrous mat from the forages that the horse is grazing or the hay the horse is eating, that will help in reducing the amount of acid splash. Mucus from the stomach reduces the effects of acid, and then mucosal blood flow, and there are some protective prostaglandins that help protect the stomach. But if the damaging factors override the protective factors, that's when we see the increased risk of gastric ulcers, which includes fasting, exercise, particularly trotting, the use of NSAIDs in treating other issues, gastric fermentation. There is a small amount of microbes in the stomach that do ferment feed in the stomach and then produce acid from primarily lactic acid from that fermentation. So that can actually increase the acidity. And research has shown that grains are more apt to cause that increased fermentation. And then reduced blood flow just from strenuous exercise or possibly dehydration can be a damaging factor. Now, the role of the diet in managing EGIS. Number one, meal feeding. Long periods without food in the stomach increases the risk of lesions. And then feed and fiber in the stomach helps reduce acid splash. So in general, we want to tell people small meals more often, as much as possible, free access to forages, because again, that helps buffer and that helps reduce the acid splash. And then high grain feeding. When you feed horses meals, especially large meals that are high in grain, the typical grains, corn, oats, barley, all are quite high starch. And that starch then can increase the fermentation and you get stomach volatile fatty acids that can damage the mucose. Plus, the high grain feeding, horses do not chew as much with grain as they do with forages. So less chewing means less saliva, therefore less buffering from the saliva. Grazing is always recommended for horses dealing with gastric ulcers. Number one, you get the protective function from the saliva, and the digestion in the stomach provides buffering. There is some research that I will show you that shows that alfalfa can be a good decreasing risk factor because it is a buffer. And then fat can help in not just fat itself. Using fat in the diet to reduce some of the soluble carbs can be helpful with ulcers. And also some fatty acids themselves can be helpful in dealing with gastric ulcers. I'll present some of that research. But this is just some old research from 1993 that just shows the effect of feed and no feed. So we have the pH, and you see when a 24-hour gastric pH with no feed to the horse, and you see the pH is, for the most part, down 1 to 2, which certainly can increase the risk of ulcers. And then when horses are given free choice grass hay, in that case, we get much more periods of time at pH of 4, which is considered more of a neutral pH in the stomach. So basically, a pH higher than 4 is considered good. pH below 4 is considered higher risk of gastric ulcers. Then in 2007 at Texas A&M, a group of researchers led by Noah Cohen fed quarter horse yearlings either a pelleted concentrate with Bermuda grass hay or alfalfa hay. It was a crossover design, two 28-day periods and a 21-day washout period. And what they saw was the ulcer severity scores were significantly lower for horses in the alfalfa hay group. So of the 11 horses with ulcer scores greater than 0, all improved by at least 2 ulcer grades while on the alfalfa diet. And in contrast, of the 12 horses fed grass hay that had ulcer scores greater than 0, 5 horses' scores were improved and only 2 were improved by at least 2 grades. And grass hay prevented only 25% of the horses without evidence of ulceration from developing ulcers. So this research is looked at to show that alfalfa does benefit in that it buffers the gastric acid. We don't really know if it's because of the high protein or the high calcium in alfalfa compared to grass hays, but both do buffer gastric acid, and so the recommendation is to feed as either chaff or hay about 30 minutes before work. Just a small amount, 500 grams to a kilo of alfalfa, can provide that buffering effect. One of the interesting results from this study that I was actually at Texas A&M, and one of the things that was seen was that the ulcer scores actually increased during the washout periods when the horses were just out on pasture. So the thought that putting horses out on free choice pasture is always going to improve the ulcer condition is actually not necessarily the case. So something just to be aware of, that just turning horses out to pasture is not always ideal for gastric ulcers. Some other research in 2004 looked at omega-6 fatty acids and EGIS. And the thought there is prostaglandins, for instance, prostaglandin E, do have potent anti-ulcer activities. And so in Florida, they studied the effect of omega-6 fatty acids on acid secretion. And they had cannulated ponies, they fed hay, they added corn oil, and they saw increased prostaglandin E2 levels and reduced gastric acid secretion. So another thing that can be helpful in dealing with gastric ulcers. So some sources of omega-6 fatty acids, which have then been recommended for this possible positive effect of the omega-6 fatty acids, would be corn oil, which is very high in omega-6s, sunflower seeds and oil, rice bran oil, stabilized rice bran, all provide significant amounts of omega-6 fatty acids. The tricky thing here is horse owners are also very concerned these days with omega-3 fatty acids, and some of these sources of omega-6 fatty acids are very low in omega-3s. So if a horse is not on green grass, receiving ample amounts of omega-3 fatty acids from the green grass, and we start supplementing with sources, for instance, corn oil that is just high in omega-6, we may be causing some issues with especially chronic inflammatory states, because some of the omega-6s are more pro-inflammatory fatty acids. The other thought is when you're feeding these higher oils, the energy from fat reduces the need for energy from starch. So are part of these effects because just the horse is getting less starch in the diet because it's getting more calories from fat? There are some more studies, more recent studies that are indicating that the omega-6 fatty acid positive results actually can be coming from a fairly specific source of omega-6. And at KER in the past few years, we've been looking at a blend of a specific long-chain omega-6 GLA with a long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And this has been very interesting, and it's very exciting research. But it's the GLA, gamma-linolenic acid, is an omega-6 fatty acid from borage oil. There are a few other sources, but borage oil is it's a source with a very high content of GLA. And then when you add that with DHA and EPA, which long-chain omega-3 fats from fish oil, one of the first research projects that KER conducted in looking at the uses of this novel source of GLA, we used fit racehorses in training, supplemented for 3 months with a 10-day washout period before the crossover, and we compared this blend of GLA and fish oil with a corn and linseed oil blend, which would provide omega-6s and omega-3s, but different omega-6s. And like the linseed oil provides ALA rather than EPA and DHA, and then a control with no supplementation at all. And the blend of GLA and fish oil actually significantly reduced severe grade 3 and 4 equine squamous gastric disease prevalence compared to the control. And the corn and linseed oil blend, there was no change in the severe ESGD prevalence and compared to the control. And the theory behind this, the GLA, the novel omega-6 oil that provides a GLA, goes through its cascade of desaturation and elongation to DGLA, and DGLA goes on through its metabolic pathway, and one of the products of DGLA is one series prostaglandin, PGE1, which, as we see, the prostaglandins can have an effect on gastric ulcers. And we also know that misoprostol is a synthetic analog of natural PGE1. So the drug misoprostol versus the natural source of GLA basically can have the same effect. The misoprostol produces a dose-related inhibition of gastric acid and pepsin secretion and enhances mucosal resistance to injury. So by just feeding a fat source, the resolvin EQ, you can get some of the same effects as the drug misoprostol. So resolvin EQ provides fatty acids to aid the body in producing less inflammatory forms of hormones, which mediates inflammation, provides substrate to feed PGE1 production, reduces gastric acid production, increases bicarbonate production, increases protective mucus production. However, it is not a buffer. Therefore, there's no immediate relief of symptoms. The recommendation is to use for at least 60 days. The trial periods were 90 days. And this is a product that is available direct to consumer or veterinary sales only. So depending what part of the world you are in, we are working to get resolvin EQ available, everywhere that we can. Some parts of the world do have access at this point to resolvin EQ, but it is a very nice option in helping to deal with treatment of gastric ulcers and then reducing the risk of future gastric ulcers. It can be used during any other treatment, omeprazole, misoprostol, sucralfate. So again, used to help prevent return of ulcers through supportive healthy balance of hormones responsible for the inflammatory response and regulation of gastric acid, bicarbonate, and mucus production. And for horses that are at high risk of gastric ulcers, it should be used long term. Now, there also are gastric coating agents and antacids that can be fed to horses that will help protect the membranes of the stomach and reduce risk of gastric ulcers. And KER has done some nice research with lecithin, whey, aluminum hydroxide and phosphate, and then calcium. And calcium is another interesting one because calcium has been used as an antacid for years for humans and horses. But there is a new source of calcium that's just really, the research just started on this in the past 6-7 years. And it's a buffered mineral complex through KER. It's called BMC, and it's derived from a unique source of marine minerals. It's a specific species of red algae, and there is a very unique form of calcium and other minerals. And it's been seen in research, it increases gastric acid buffering 2.7 times. It holds the gastric pH greater than 4 when measured 1 hour after feeding. And so the KER product Triactin has this bone buffered mineral complex as one of its ingredients. And so the research on the buffering capacity of this specific marine-derived calcium has been really incredible. And so this is another supplement that can be used as a buffer for the acid in the stomach. So just in general, EGGD prevention and treatment, again, we don't have as many feeding-related treatments, but going through, I'm sure you've already heard the treatment with the drug treatment, minimum of 2 rest days a week, turnout and grazing, minimize stress, but feeding alfalfa 30 minutes before exercise is recommended. Anti-inflammatories such as fish oil, which provides the omega-3s, DHA and EPA, or resolvin EQ, which provides the GLA as well as EPA and DHA. And then it needs long-term treatment, at least 8 weeks, and then monitor every 4 weeks. So feeding to reduce risk of EGUS. Feed sufficient good quality forage, ad lib or at least minimum 1% of their body weight per day. Grazing, don't keep horses away from forage for more than 6 hours. We want to keep the buffering Number one, from the saliva. Number two, we want to keep the fiber mat to help reduce the acid splashing. Alfalfa is a great buffer. Chaff, hay, or haylage. A small amount of alfalfa 30 to 60 minutes prior to work for the fiber mat and the buffering. Add chaff to slow intake and encourage more saliva through more chewing. Feed little and often for smaller meals. Controlled starch diet. Particularly for squamous ulcers. And with a controlled starch diet, you're going to look at more energy from fat and less from starch and sugars. We don't have a lot of data on EGGD prevention through feeding. Unfortunately, at this time, there's so much more that we need to know on glandular ulcers. And this is a chart that we put together because horse owners are always very excited these days about how much NSC, non-structural carbs, or starch plus sugar they can feed to horses, because there are all these different carbohydrate sensitivities. And since with gastric ulcers, one of the recommendations is to feed a controlled starch diet, horse owners start thinking, oh goodness, we need to feed them something that just has almost no starch. Realistically, no, they don't. And we are starting to see horses that performance is actually compromised when they're not getting adequate NSC in their diets. So this chart is just to help with an idea of where the NSC can be in a meal to keep the level below the maximum recommended. So as you see on the bottom, to reduce the risk of EGIS, basically squamous gastric disease, you limit starch intake to less than or equal 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal. So in that second column, that is the 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal. So if you've got a feed that is very high in NSC, such as straight oats, for an 1100 or 1100 pound, 500 kilo horse, we're looking at about 2.5 pounds of oats in a meal to keep the diet below that 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal. Then as the concentrate feed, as the NSC drops in the concentrate feed, the horses can be fed larger meals without exceeding that 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal. So a 35% NSC feed, which is going to be these days a typical commercial sweet feed, corn, oats, molasses, premix pellet. For that kind of feed, for a 500 kilo horse, we're looking at about 3.5 pounds of feed. 27% NSC, we're up to 5 pounds of feed. 17% NSC, we're up to 6.5. 15% NSC, 7 pounds. And a 10% NSC, you can feed 11 pounds for an 1,100 pound horse and not be exceeding that NSC limit. And this is for gastric ulcers. So the people who for gastric ulcers are looking for these very, very low NSC feeds, particularly performance horses, they don't need to be that extravagant in what they're looking for. So a 15, 17% NSC, they're just fine. And then supplementation to reduce the risk of EGIS. Fatty acid supplementation, again, DHA, EPA, GLA. Marine-derived calcium source, antacids. Another thing people usually don't think about is if they're giving electrolytes, the straight electrolytes, salt, basically, you give them salt in an ulcer environment, and it's basically salt on a wound. So giving them a buffered electrolyte source, so the electrolytes actually go on through, they're buffered all the way through the stomach and get into the small intestine where they're absorbed, and then that does not exacerbate the ulcers in the stomach. And of course, in all supplements, we recommend looking for specific research data to show efficacy, because there are hundreds and hundreds of supplements recommended, and you start looking for specific research data and your choice of supplements drastically goes down. So that was enough on the stomach. Let's look at the you know the total equine digestive tract. The small stomach is designed for small, frequent meals, feeding meals of more than 2.5 kilos at a time, or about 5 pounds at a time, particularly if it's high starch feeds, can result in poor feed conversion efficiency, GI upset, possible hindgut acidosis, and or colic. So a major goal in equine nutrition is, of course, keeping that digestive tract happy and healthy, and a happy horse then eats well. So the next thing I want to talk about is the hindgut acidosis and dysbiosis, because that's a very common condition from grain or pastures that are high in fructans, the particular polysaccharide fructans. Can lead to loose manure, also can lead to reduced appetite, reduced feed efficiency and weight loss, behavior changes, and colic and or laminitis. Why is the low pH in the hindgut detrimental? Because the pH in the stomach is quite low, but the pH in the hindgut is much more neutral. And that is because of the fiber digesting bacteria, which are a large portion of the function of the hindgut. And these fiber digesting bacteria are progressively inhibited as the hindgut pH decreases and becomes more acidic. And at a pH below 6.5, you can see drastically inhibited normal fiber digestion or fermentation. So laminitis occurs when lactic acid accumulates and the pH is significantly lowered and bacteria are lysed, resulting in a release of endotoxins from their cell walls. So as you can see from this little graphic, favorable on the far right in pink is 6.5 to 7, so it's pretty basic. And then when it gets below 6, you see a decrease in fiber fermenting bacteria, increase in lactic acid and volatile fatty acids, and increase in permeability of the membrane, the lining of the hindgut. And then below 5.8, when we're getting fairly acidic, we see long-term damage, absorption issues, and then laminitis. So dropping it just from favorable down a bit can just be caused from stress. Getting below 6 can be caused by drastic diet changes, high grain diets, and then high fructan pastures, and seasonal changes, plant stresses. All of these things together can cause the hindgut acidosis and get the pH down below 5.8. Horses are very sensitive to grain, starch, or fructans and have a limited ability to digest them in the upper gut. So one of the big things we want to make sure is we don't provide so much soluble carb, including fructans, that it overflows the upper gut into the hindgut and then causes all this cascade of increased, it's actually increased fermentation by the starch digesting microbes in the hindgut, which there always are some, but when you get a sudden influx of starch and fructans, the starch digesting microbes then really increase in their populations drastically. And one of the fermentation products of starch is, of course, lactic acid. And you get more and more lactic acid produced, decreasing the pH. You get hindgut acidosis. And in that situation, you get disruption of the microbial population or the microbiota and microbiome, causes a release of toxins, reduced feed conversion efficiency, and in severe cases, laminitis. And this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but again, high grain or high fructan intake can lead to very low pH, subclinical acidosis, and in product that we never want to see is colic or laminitis. So what could help in this situation is a buffer that could actually reach the hindgut, and that's hard to do because, like, for instance, typically bicarbonate, which is a great buffer, it's going to be absorbed in the small intestine and never even reach the hindgut. So how can you get a buffer into the hindgut to help reduce the risk of acidosis? So Kentucky Equine Research developed a time release buffer for use in the horse. It's called Equisure, and it is simply um, an encapsulated source of bicarb that actually reaches the hindgut. And there's a great deal of research behind this product, Equisure, the hindgut buffer. And I'm not going to go into great detail because we don't have time to go through each project in detail. But this is old research from 1975 that shows the changes in fecal pH following a meal of hay or a meal of grain. And you can see the meal of hay reduces the fecal pH somewhat, slightly, but it's still at a healthy level. But a meal of grain, and this would be a fairly large meal of grain that some of the starch reaches the hindgut, and you can see the fecal pH in this situation gets down significantly lower than from hay. So in studies conducted at KER, pH was higher in the hindgut of horses consuming significant quantities of grain and Equisure versus control horses, which were on just the grain without Equisure. And since then, additional studies have shown significant decreases in lactic acid accumulation in the hindgut of control horses consuming less pasture versus Equisure. And here are some of the results. These were 6 horses fed 2 to 3 kilos of sweet feed. And you can see the fecal pH for the horses on the supplement, the buffered hindgut supplement Equisure in blue. You can see there was a small change in pH, but it was significantly higher, less change than the control horses that did not receive the buffer. And this just shows the effect of the grain meal on fecal lactate. So again, the control horses that did not get the buffer had much more lactate in the feces. And so following a grain meal, Equisure supplemented horses had less fecal lactate and experienced a smaller change in pH than control horses. This also is very important when you have sudden pasture access, because we all know that horses that get a big change in, for instance, a primarily hay diet and then go out to pasture, or if the pasture has been dormant and suddenly gets rain. I'm in Kansas and we've just gotten a bunch of rain and everything is green now. 2 weeks ago, everything was brown. So there's a great amount of nice lush forage, and this forage can be high in the polysaccharide fructan. And fructans are not digested and absorbed in the upper gut, but they function more as a fiber and pass through the upper gut intact to the hindgut. But in the hindgut, they're not fermented as a typical fiber. They're fermented more like a starch. And so again, high lactic acid, decreased pH, you know, all the same sort of issues as when horses get fed too much grain in a meal. So in this study, the lactic acid accumulation was greater in the control group on pasture grass than the Equisure fed group. That meant the Equisure was effective and the hindgut was functioning optimally. And this is a chart showing fructan, the specific fructan inulin challenge. So the Equisure horses, green is the pre-inulin and red is after the inulin challenge. And you can see the horses on Equisure did not have a significant difference in the fecal lactate versus the control horses. So they did have hindgut, the control horses did exhibit hindgut acidosis from the fructan challenge, and the horses on Equisure did not. And changes in fecal lactate after exposure to pasture, the same thing. The horses on Equisure had much less of a change in fecal lactate compared to the control horses. So another excellent feeding technology to use for to help some of these issues with hindgut acidosis is the time-released hindgut buffer. with the encapsulation technology, so it's protected through the stomach and small intestine. And then there's a timed gradual release within the target environment, which is the hindgut. Active buffer is sodium bicarb. It balances the hindgut pH and it restores and maintains the optimal environment for microbiota. And it's the only product of its kind. We've not seen anything else that functions like EquiShure. So some clinical applications: anorexia, colic, other than, of course, impactions or torsions, grain overload, laminitis, diarrhea can be helpful in the prevention, treatment, and supportive therapy with horses with chronic diarrhea. And of course, the end goal is to avoid hindgut acidosis. So all of the feeding techniques here would be small meals more often to minimize the risk of overloading the upper gut with soluble carbs, controlled starch and sugar, calories from fat, processed grains. Processed grains tend to be more digestible and more easily sugars and starches digested and absorbed in the upper gut. More fiber, because fiber is very helpful for the hindgut, certainly does not cause acidosis. Taking care with pasture fructans. Horse owners need to be thinking about when the pasture is green and lush, especially horses that are sensitive and prone to laminitis, how best to manage these situations. And then again, hindgut buffer, the EquiShure. And the starch limit per meal, I'm going to keep referring to this chart because the starch limit per meal to reduce the risk of hindgut acidosis is different than the starch limit per meal for gastric ulcers. So if all we're trying to do is help ensure that we don't have an overload of NSC into the hindgut, then our limit is 2 grams per kilo body weight per meal. So that's a higher level of NSC in the concentrate feed, as you can see. In this case, even oats is not that risky, but you get a typical sweet feed, and you can feed 7 pounds a meal, 27%, which I would consider a moderate NSC, 9 pounds per meal. So in these situations, horse owners don't have to be nearly as concerned about every gram of NSC in their horse's diet. And then right dorsal colitis. This is an interesting one because right dorsal colitis has been an issue for years that we've known about this. It's a fairly common side effect of NSAID use. And you see inflammation and ulceration of the colon leads to loss of protein, fever, colic, inappetence, diarrhea. It's difficult to treat, so we've got to be careful with NSAIDs. But fairly recently, we've known that NSAIDs are associated with right dorsal colitis, but the etiology and why lesions are confined to this area is largely unknown. This is from a review article from 2017. And there were some questions. Is there an alteration of the profile of VFAs produced? Does the anatomy play a role? And then in 2022, a group of researchers actually linked use of NSAIDs to decreased bicarbonate production in the right dorsal colon, which was really exciting because, quite honestly, we didn't really realize that the right dorsal colon, the NSAIDs, that there was bicarbonate secretion in the right dorsal colon. So the results from this research investigating the link between the bicarb secretion in the colon, and they were looking at the effect of phenylbutazone secretion on the secretion. And what they saw was that NSAIDs suppressed the secretion of bicarb in the right dorsal colon, potentially resulting in less buffering capacity of colonic mucosa and contributing to pathogenesis of right dorsal colitis, and possibly also a role of prostaglandins. And the researchers suggested a potential method to replace lost bicarb, possibly a protected version of bicarb anion, to deliver ineffective concentrations to the right dorsal colon, since enterally administered sodium bicarb likely does not make it that far. So at Kentucky Equine Research, we saw that and said, gosh, we have EquiShure already. We didn't even know, but this is a really It buffers the hindgut. So in use of NSAIDs and the risk of right dorsal colitis, we are highly recommending now that veterinarians use EquiSure when NSAIDs are being used. So that was a pretty exciting finding. Also, soluble carb sensitivities, equine metabolic syndrome, insulin dysregulation, PPID with insulin dysregulation and laminitis. I'm going back to my chart because, again, feeding to reduce the risk of these medical situations, to reduce the risk of exacerbation of insulin dysregulation, insulin resistance, the recommendation is to limit starch intake to less than or equal to 0.3 grams per kilo body weight per meal. And that's a recommendation we have been using for several years. But in 2022, a group of researchers in Kentucky looked at the insulin response to NSC in the diet using a herd of obese, sedentary, metabolic horses. And they were just looking at the glucose insulin response, and the meals they were feeding, they used a purified starch, and they also used a purified sugar in feeding these horses. And they suggested in that research that for these horses, 0.1 grams per kilo body weight per meal is really the maximum to reduce the risk of a very heightened glucose insulin response. And the horse world has kind of gotten hold of this, and horse owners are just looking for almost no NSC in their horses' diets. But I wanted to put this in here to caution, these are obese, sedentary, metabolic horses. And in this research, even looking at these heightened glucose insulin responses, they didn't precipitate laminitis in any of these horses. So this is very interesting information that we need more research. We want to continue looking at, the responses in metabolic horses. But I want to caution particularly horse owners and veterinarians dealing with horse owners in these situations. These are high-risk metabolic horses. So quite honestly, for most horses that are insulin dysregulated, PPID, metabolic, I'm still using the 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight per meal and recommending that the horse owners get the weight down, exercise their horses, all the things that we can do to increase insulin sensitivity. Going to mention probiotics, prebiotics, and postbiotics. Probiotics are direct-fed microbials, and at this point, they're generally regarded as safe, but we have disappointing results in the science. They're looking at the bottom of this slide, there's some research.
I'm sorry, Dr. Young, we are over the time.
That is just fine. I will just strap right down to for more information, and please feel free to contact us. We're happy to answer any questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you.